Hello, everyone. Welcome back to not Britain's Hangout Hour, but it's another episode, February edition of The State of Science Fiction, where I talk about one of my favorite genres, and, well, the state of science fiction. Har, har, har. Anyway, the guest I have here today is Raf from Raf Blutaxt. How you doing, man? Wait, God. Oh, yeah. Oh,
I'm doing good. Cheers.
oh, it's so satisfying. Oh man, I gotta say
It is.
it's been it's been forever since we've talked, bro. You know, it's like it's not like we had a discussion a few weeks ago about
you
if
know,
fantasy is
forever
literature.
and time is relative, which is one of the things we might be talking about today.
But yeah, you were one of the first people I thought of when I started this series up because I mean, you talk a lot about fantasy on your YouTube channel, but you also talk about science fiction and other
Yeah.
forms of speculative fiction on your channel when you find the time.
I have read the odd science fiction book here or there from time to time. Some
And
of them may even have involved, rockets and spaceships and stuff.
and considering your tendency to contemplate our navels, I thought that you would have some interesting opinions on the state of science fiction, which is
Yeah,
why I
I
started this
might.
show.
Yeah, that was one of the questions. Like what led you to start a show called The State of Science Fiction?
Well, it's actually kind of funny. When we talked about Brandon Sanderson a while back, and you kind of explained to me that, like, you don't really have any real issues with, like, the guy or his work in general. It's more like if I remember right, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's like the marketing is what you kind of have an issue with.
Yeah, that's about right for now.
It's kind of like that, except sci-fi. Not just one author. It's just kind of
Yeah,
because
okay. So you're
I
more
find
looking at
that
like, yeah.
because I find like I've noticed, or at least my concern is that sci-fi and fantasy are starting to kind of meld together, which isn't a bad thing, I should note. And it's always been a thing of science fiction. They're always lumped together, and for good reason. They're kind of the outlaw genres, to paraphrase something Michael Moorcock once said. But
Hmm.
I guess my concern about the state of science fiction, why I started this show, is because I don't know. I was starting to get worried that sci-fi is losing its identity because the tropes and the because science fiction and fantasy are starting to kind of, oh, how do I put it, meld together, maybe. Is that cool? Like,
Yeah.
I'll see something like the Empire of Silence, and that would be interesting to get Christopher Rocchio on the show. He seems like, I haven't read any of his books yet, but he seems like a really interesting man to talk to. But I'm getting off topic. I'll
Yeah.
see books like that, and it makes me wonder if sci-fi is losing its identity. So I wanted to get here and team up with some of the brightest minds on BookTube to talk about it. Or, well, at least
Well,
enthusiasts of, or at least fellow enthusiasts.
yeah, I was going to say I'm honored you think of me as a bright mind, but I you might be mistaken. Anyway, my point is to start with, I think the separation of science fiction and fantasy in a lot of ways is, from what I can tell, a bit of a marketing thing that happened later in like the 1960s and 70s with your very specific form of science fiction sort of breaking off. But when you look back, there's a lot of situations where people considered what we now call fantasy just a form of science fiction.
That's interesting. What do you mean by that? Just like how they described it was kind of scientific, or
Now they just use the term science fiction. I mean, they used terms like sword and sorcery and adventure fiction and so forth in the 30s. And
oh
then
yeah.
for a long time, it was just called science fiction until, forms of fantasy became more popular. I guess partly that's with the Ballantine adult fantasy series of novel, well, releases, re-releases, and so forth in the 1960s. But for a long time, those borders between fantasy and science fiction were very, very fluid, and you have like authors writing both all at the same time, all the way back to the 1930s. It's like, say, whatever it is that H.P. Lovecraft writes, for example, is that science fiction? Is that fantasy? Is it something else? Is
That's
it
a whole.
horror?
That's a whole different rabbit hole.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting to look at that, or say Jack Vance writing *The Dying Earth*. Is that fantasy or is that science fiction? Because
Gene Wolfe, I've heard similar.
yeah, Gene Wolfe was definitely influenced by *Dying Earth*, but it comes like 30 years later. But I think the idea is that these genres have often been more intertwined than we're ready to sort of admit. And then at some point, for marketing reasons, I guess, they get split, and it's like, yeah, fantasy is stuff with swords, and sci-fi is stuff with rocket ships, and we'll just all ignore Star Wars because whatever. You know what I mean?
I mean, I would call Star Wars like a fantasy story, just with a sci-fi backdrop. Like it's kind of
Yeah, but
what it is.
what about Dune?
That's similar thing though. There is more scientific speculation than Star Wars, because Star Wars is a more archetypal story, and not to say
Yeah,
that Dune isn't, but Dune is more like, oh, where are we gonna be in the future? Though
yeah,
Dune isn't one of my favorite science fiction stuff, but it is something. It is a touchstone of the genre, so I can't ignore it.
yeah.
It's
I just,
kind of like Lord of
yeah,
the Rings for fantasy. You can't ignore it, even if you're not really, um, unless you're
yeah.
Michael Moorcock, who just fumes at the prospect of Lord of the Rings being the popular one. Poor guy.
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken on that topic before. I think like even Michael Moorcock understands the value of Lord of the Rings.
Well, sure. I was
It's
being a
more
little
about like,
facetious there.
no, no, I think it's like the his criticism is often more about the idea that Lord of the Rings gets copied by people who don't necessarily understand what Lord of the Rings is doing and are just taking the trappings, and that kind of becomes a more problematic thing. But we should probably focus on the rockets and not so much on Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I don't want to get too carried away, but I think science fiction has a really interesting history, because we first kind of, because I mean, there's people who say it started out with Mary Shelley, which, I mean, I get it with Frankenstein, but I mean, I'm
Yeah,
sure you have asterisks to add, but I would say that I don't know if I agree with that, but I do think our modern conception of science fiction might start there. Um,
yeah. I think it's a good place to start. I agree with that. And then you have your Jules Verne
mhm.
science fictional like scientific adventure stories in the later 19th century, and then you get to your H.G. Wells and move from there to all kinds of crazy stuff. And that's why I meant with say Lovecraft, because Lovecraft has stuff that happens in space, and you have like a story like The Color Out of Space, which is a horror story, or is it a fantasy story, or
I
is it
kind of
something
view it
else?
more
Because it's
as
like
a
about a
sci-fi
meteorite.
horror story, but
Yeah, the
Lovecraft. I
things
mean,
shift.
I he popularized cosmic horror. I don't think he invented it. A lot of people, there were people doing it before he did it. Robert Chambers, Ambrose Bierce. But yeah, again, I don't want to get too
Yeah, Arthur
carried away.
Mark, and yeah, but I know what you mean. I think see science fiction is not as clear cut as a genre as you might think. There's obviously stuff where we're like, yeah, this is science fiction. The rockets. I think it's a Lavi Tita said that once. Like, science fiction is stuff that has spaceships on the cover,
Yeah,
which is which is a very good way of classifying it. Because yeah, let's go with that for now. I mean, is something like your John Carter of Mars, is that science fiction or is that fantasy?
that's a good
And now,
point.
of course, we have like stuff like Sword and Planet or whatever you want to call it.
Just basically sword and sorcery on Mars. You're like, okay,
Yeah, but
all right.
that's kind of the question, because it's like, how do you define a
And
genre
there's
like science fiction?
and there's planetary romance, which is
Yeah,
which is basically Sword and Planet, which is another word for
Yeah,
Sword and Planet, or stuff that H.G. Wells was doing, um, and Jules Verne as well.
yeah.
There's also the new wave where stuff got really freaking weird, and now we're where we're at, where we're in this kind of weird spot, or at least I think so, which is why I started this show, because I think science fiction is a little underrated here on BookTube. I mean, we'll have conversation. I mean, we're having a conversation about it right now, and there are people who cover science fiction books, but
But you're right about it, though. It's something I've been like a while ago. I've like it's an ongoing thing that I like years ago with a bunch of friends. Right, we have like we always had like a strong like tabletop role playing game community with my former flatmate and my current flatmate and the flatmate before my former flat. Friends. And one of those things we realize is that there's a shitload of fantasy role playing games, Dungeons and Dragons. No, GURPS is not like the best. There's always been a lot of that stuff, but when it comes to science fiction, it's much more difficult. We're always wondering, like, why is fantasy so big and science fiction so difficult, so rare or not as popular? It's like,
I don't know if it's
what's
rare. It's just
when it
kind
comes to
of
tabletop role
it can be
playing
kind of
games, it's
harder to
certainly a
sell, I
much
guess.
smaller market share, I think.
Though I mean, I guess there are a couple of sci-fi role playing games. I mean, they made a Firefly one, but I don't know how you feel about
Yeah, there's Traveler, but like when it comes to market shares, it's always much less. And the question is like, why is that? When like for a long time, I guess science fiction had like a much higher market share when it came to actual books.
I guess my concern with science fiction, why I started this series anyway, is I'm concerned that kind of to paraphrase something Arthur C. Clarke said, um, I'm afraid it may meld so deeply into fantasy it becomes indistinguishable from fantasy. It's just which again I don't want to say that's a bad thing, but I guess I'm just worried about science fiction losing its identity in our modern age because we're kind of living in a science fiction world right now, Raph. We're talking on face screens. I mean, God, the golden age guys would be just g- give me the checks
Yeah,
right now. We called it. Checks.
yeah, but I think like we're always talking about like, hey, we're basically living in a sci-fi world, and then yet again, when you look at science fiction books, it took a long time for people to actually predict like smartphone, like mobile phones in general, or stuff like that. So, um, I think there's one aspect of this all is that science fiction has to sort of measure up, or is measured up against our lived reality and our experienced reality, which means that it can age really poorly when something, you predict something that goes completely wrong. The whole like, oh, why don't we have flying cars? I got promised flying cars back in the day by the Jetsons.
we did get
And
we did get self driving cars though.
yeah, right.
Which that I mean, hell, we're in kind of the age of AI right now. We're kind of just we're on the peak.
uh, I have some opinions on the state of technology, but I think my point still stands, right? Like science fiction, we can always measure against our lived reality, whereas fantasy doesn't have to do that. Like with fantasy, we already say like this is something that is impossible,
Mm.
whereas science fiction as a book as a genre has to be sort of plausible. It's like what it,
Kind of
you know what I
reminds me
mean?
of
It's
something
like
Ray Bradbury said. Science fiction, or maybe it was Rod Serling who said it. I don't remember, but it's about science fiction is about what's plausible.
yes, you explore possible futures, whereas with fantasy you explore impossible futures. Both have their value, but it makes a job harder for science fiction because it has to always sort of contend with current issues in a lot of ways, right? It's like one of those things you can see when you look back at like what kind of different ideas of science fiction you had. You have like for a long time you had like very specific, eras of like your golden age science fiction, your 1950s, 60s stuff, which is all about technology. Then you have your cyberpunk starting in the 80s, which is all about like the influence of capitalism on technology and how that
Mm-hmm.
kind of dehumanizes the individual and makes us just all cogs in a machine of a system that we've kind of built and can find it hard to climb out of. And then you move on to where we are right now. And it's like, well, I guess we have to do climate stuff right now because that's sort of the thing that technology will have to face right now. You can obviously deal with issues of gender and other topics that are deemed political, but climate change is certainly the thing where science fiction can go wild and you can go like, yeah, here's how I would solve the climate problem. And you have, authors that tackle that. You have like a Kim Stanley Robinson writing Ministry for the Future, or
You have Vandermeer.
you have Vandermeer, definitely. You have Neil
S-
Stevenson, who's always been fairly good at putting his finger sort of on the pulse of time when it comes to technology
Sorry, I'm a big
writing.
Vandermeer fan. What can I say?
Yeah, no. Vandermeer is really good about that. And Vandermeer has certainly made environmentalism a core part of his writing.
Well, I mean, I'll get to the first question before we get too tangenty, but Raph, what makes a great science fiction story? At least in your opinion.
As opposed to other genres where I would say this makes a good story. I don't like for me when I look back at like the last couple of good science fiction books that I read, and like these are the ones that I really enjoyed. I think it's a certain urgency when it comes to sort of probing the future of our of mankind in a lot of ways. A certain urgency in that, combined with sort of a cultural realism in the way that it does sort of imagine cultures or the future of different cultures, civilizations, whatever you want to call them. Um, and beyond that, of course, good plot, good characters. But like, I think that urgency, that willingness to shape the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I guess what I meant is, like I was talking about more like the soul. I mean, like not necessarily good ideas and characterization.
Eh,
Because like I mean, what I look for is kind of I guess the science fiction I enjoy is the one that speculates about our nature and where we'll be in the
mm.
future. So I mean, I could be wrong. That might sound very pretentious. I apologize.
No. I think you're right. I think the issue there is that like all fiction speculates about our nature. I think you're definitely right there. I think science fiction makes that somewhat more explicit because it goes like, "Hey, this is what humans will be like in the year whatever,
uh,
2024 plus X,"
like
and it does that, which kind of makes it very clear that you're looking at how human nature changes, and I think that's sort of something I personally appreciate about a lot of science fiction, or what makes good science fiction for me, is the understanding that we can't just remain who we are right now, that we need to change, that we need to adapt, that we need to move on, that we need to change. That
mm,
willingness to accept that. That's what I think what I meant with like when I said like urgency, sort of
mm,
in a sense, like the willingness to face the fact that we as a species will change, and we might have to change rapidly, and we might have to change rather dramatically as well. And I think that part, I think, is important for science fiction, whereas fantasy, because fantasy is so often, not necessarily, but like very often, is sort of backwards facing
mm.
into like wouldn't it be nice if it could be like that, whereas science fiction is more like forward facing, goes like, well, we should probably do something so we could end up in a better place.
Yeah, I mean, there's even stuff like Star Trek that speculate like what we're gonna be like in the far future, and or even
Yeah,
today. But I think the best science fiction for me anyway is about human nature
yeah.
necessarily, and it is about like, oh, I mean, I try to look, I try to look for something deeper rather than, oh, great characters and plot, because I'm like, well, okay, what does that mean? I mean, I get that, like that's a good part of storytelling, but that's not what I mean.
So I guess like my question would be like, what are like the last or like the newest science fiction books you or stories you read that you found interesting or good? Like
Oh,
what
that's
like
actually
the
one of the
latest
questions, but
sci-fi releases you really enjoyed?
but yeah, I'll answer. I would say, I actually read Light recently, or actually I read it last year by
I'm John Harrison.
M. John Harrison, which might be the most unique science fiction novel I've read in a while. Probably should read it again because I was kind of a little thrown off by it, but here we are. It kind of reminded me of Philip K. Dick's work, except not as acidy. um, I would say that
Yeah,
Born from Jeff Vandermeer is, well, in my opinion, might be the best science fiction novel that I've read this century. So, like, there could
I
be other
have
ones
not
out there.
yet read Born, but I kind of know what it's about. I know my former flatmate really hated
Wow.
it. Now he read it and he got really angry because he just read like we both had read Finch by Vandermeer before,
Oh yeah.
and
I
he
still
was
need to read his
expecting
fantasy stuff.
yeah, and he kind of expected something like Finch, and he got like, I don't get what this is about. I'm like, sounds interesting. I just need to find the time to actually go there.
But yeah. Who else? I've been kind of picky. I've been really bad at keeping up with science fiction. I did read Kindred by Octavia Butler, though. If that's science fiction, I don't know because she likes to blend genres.
Yeah,
Um,
nah, definitely. I would say it's more like I mean, at the end of the day, it's more of like a historical fiction that uses time travel as a conceit to make its point, right?
yeah, pretty much. I enjoyed it a lot, though. Um, that was my first book I gave 5 stars to this year. So yeah, we'll see how that
Hmm.
goes. But I liked it a lot. Aside from that, I've been really terrible at keeping up with science fiction recently. Again, which is why I started this show.
Hmm.
Because I'm trying to uh, make my dues here. And also, maybe I'll find some new sci-fi writers to read. I've also heard like Jeff Noon might be one I might enjoy.
Well, Jeff Noon's newest is more of a fantasy book. It's a weird one. I think you might enjoy it anyway because it definitely has that China Mieville touch to it.
Oh yeah, I've heard it's like Perdido Street Station. I'm like, oh, Perdido Street Station. You say? Oh, I gotta read
I think
this. It'll.
Gog Magog is not like Petito Street Station, but it does have certain parallels. I would say that it's more of an adventure story, and it's really fun. It's really cool. I really enjoyed it,
Um.
and it's definitely weird, and it has that level of weirdness that you know from Petito Street Station. It's
I'm
yeah, it's
thinking.
different, but it's definitely worth reading. I think you might enjoy it.
I also um enjoyed. Well, it's a comic, but it's called Descender. I like that a little bit, but
Hmm.
but yeah, again, I'm
Yeah,
really bad at keeping up with science fiction because
yeah,
I don't know, it's been kind of tough looking for stuff you might like.
yeah.
Um,
So here's a bunch of books I
I'm
think
actually
are
hoping to read
interesting.
Ubik this year. As a matter of fact, that's funny that you. That's funny. That's actually I just remembered that. Yeah, I'm hoping to read Ubik this year.
Ubik is really cool. Ubik is really cool and really fun. It's also incredibly weird and psychedelic.
Oh, I wouldn't
So
expect any less from PKD, sir.
it does
That's why I
have a
read
bit
PKD
more
because
of
it's
a
fucking weird and
sort of tongue-in-cheek fun part to it. I think it's more absurdist than some of his other stuff.
might have to
Less depressing.
Um, yeah, I'm
It's
hoping to
good.
read that this year because I want to see what the. Well, that's another series I'm doing, but I'm not. I wasn't made to read that by my beloved audience.
But here's an interesting thing. When I look back at like what I read last year, there's a bunch of science fiction books I read last year that came out last year. I think it's more my point. Some of them I read earlier this year.
You read
One of them is certainly In Ascension by Martin McInnes, which got longlisted for a Booker Prize, which
sorry about
quite
that.
the honor for a science fiction book.
Yeah, that's another interesting thing because like science fiction is weird. It's one of those weird things about science fiction where like it kind of gets respected now, and in case like if you're the right writer, I guess you get like some
Yeah,
like I mentioned this when we had our podcast episode a few months back.
yeah.
Because I really like. Well, I remember really enjoying Slaughterhouse Five by Kurt Vonnegut, and I would like to read
Mm.
that again at some point, to see if it holds up in my memory. Because my memory is it's usually good, but for some reason I've kind of forgotten about Slaughterhouse Five for some reason. But it's like he's kind of wacky and out there with his sci-fi concepts. So why is he considered like good literature and like PKD is just like this weird paranoiac guy who's writes about like
I think
burned out drug
there's a bunch
addicts.
of things that come together when we're talking about Kurt Vonnegut, because he does use sort of techniques that are sort of more aligned with postmodern literature in general. So he's much closer to, say, a Thomas Pynchon or whatever. Same as Philip K. Dick, who's also fairly respected because they are using techniques and elements from general literary fiction of the time. Plus, the idea of like the sense of paranoia, I think, is key there, because paranoia is definitely a main theme of the 20th century in a lot of ways. With the Cold War and everything, you can kind of see where that is coming from, right? The sense of paranoia is real in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a key part there why Vonnegut gets a certain respect that, say, an Arthur C. Clarke or an Isaac Asimov doesn't necessarily get.
Sure, yeah, and I mean, I won't pretend that like Asimov is like perfect or anything. I mean, I don't read like I read his books because I'm intrigued by. Well, I like iRobot, but then again, I like AI. But
Yeah.
that's another question for a little later on. But what I think makes a great science fiction story is
Mm-hmm.
well, I find the golden zone really is when there's that speculation about our nature, if that makes sense, alongside our speculation of the future. I like it when it's combined together. Like I like Philip K. Dick not just because his ideas are just out there, but he also speculates on what's the nature of reality. How does that affect human beings? I really like about PKD is how he combines mundane reality with just complete insanity. Like all of his like oddly, for as out there and bizarre as PKD is, like a lot of his people are mundane, average even, or at least I think so anyway. Oh no, Raph has knocked over the thing again. Oh dear, it's not good. Might have to cut this part out, ladies and gentlemen. Mm. Well, here we are. Sorry about, or well,
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Wonderful. I don't know what happened. I get kicked out again, maybe because of you, maybe because of me. Who knows?
That was weird.
But we were
Um,
talking about Philip K. Dick and
oh, sorry.
his
I was, I
love.
was, I was, I was laying out my thesis on why I think PKD is the shit, and I was gonna see what you had to say about it,
I
and then
was.
you got cut off.
I heard most of it, and I think like the important part with Philip K. Dick that we need to understand is like Philip K. Dick was on a shitload of drugs.
That is true. He was also very likely mentally ill.
Yeah. Um. The two things make
There we go. A little pixely, but
now.
I can see you now. All
I
right.
don't know if the that bad. I have no idea what's.
All right, but I can hear you fine. So, all right, I'll just start it back up here. All right, so we had some fuckery going on. That's probably the best thing I could describe it as. I don't think it was my internet, but we'll see. But Raph, what were you saying about PKT? Please, God, like
All right. So
karma,
Philip K. Dick.
God, whatever. Please, just
Okay, I think I made the joke that Philip K. Dick is obviously on drugs, but I think there's an interesting thing there, which is that science fiction is always, depending on when you read it or when it was written, reliant on what part of the sciences is currently en vogue. So, the situations where it's all about like rocket technology, which is like the 1950s and 60s, which is when both the Soviet Union and the US are building rockets to shoot stuff into the sky, and that's where you get like a lot of like rocket ship stuff going on, and
so yeah.
you
I've
have
heard Gravity's
this
Rainbows about that. Um,
among other things, and then you have stuff set in or written in the early 80s, which is when cyber technology happens, and
mhm,
or computers become sort of like a more acceptable thing, and suddenly you get cyberpunk and stuff like that.
mhm.
And what people like Philip K. Dick, I think, tap into is another part of that. That is the boom of both psychology or psychoanalysis and related sort of not quite sciences. By which I mean like the 1930s and 1940s and early 1950s are full of people finally figuring out that psychology might work. A lot of our problems might go away if we actually sometimes talked about them and figured out what is wrong with that. Which is the climate where say an L. Ron Hubbard can also build something like psychology. And during that time, you have a lot of these like we're still figuring out stuff. We might be able to unleash the power of our mind and do all kinds of crazy mind stuff. It's where books like The Morning of the Magicians get published, which is I supposedly nonfiction book about all kinds of weird not parasocial, parapsychology and stuff like that. It is a time where the possibility that stuff outside of what we can perceive right now, our normal perceptions, where stuff like that seems plausible or possible. And I think that's an important aspect to someone like Philip K. Dick, who starts writing and publishing in the 50s,
Mhm.
and that's where the experimentation with a lot of especially psychedelic drugs kind of comes in. I mean, we're talking about 1950s and 1960s. We have of course the more like counterculture movements. We also have stuff like MK Ultra, where the CIA is fucking drugging people to see what happens. So I think that's kind of an important part to what Philip K. Dick taps into, and sometimes up to a point, people like Kurt Vonnegut as well, right? Is that feeling of paranoia that is an essential part of 50s, 60s, and 70s, especially US culture, with that idea of, that there are maybe different ways of perceiving reality. It's where a lot of like weird psychedelic cultures and stuff like cults and stuff come in, where a lot of like drug culture, counterculture builds in. But it's one aspect of a general like societal awareness, I guess, and Dick channels that. Thomas Pynchon does sort of tap into the same thing.
Yeah, I've
He
heard
often
him be
does so
called
like
science fiction,
later
which
on.
I thought was
Hmm?
interesting because I mean, I've only read one of his books, Inherent Vice. I actually want to read it again. I don't know if I was in the right headspace when I was reading it, but I did get that PKD kind of paranoia, grand conspiracy, what is reality type of thing going on here.
Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of the point, right? Is
Which
that
only reinforced my doubts. I'm like, okay, why is this book right here? You know, why is it? Or well, it's backwards now because it's on my end anyway because Streamyard's a dick. But why is that great literature? And I mean, I guess, and yeah, I guess it's not really fair to say that now because like PKD is getting more respect as we're getting older, and also there's more adaptations of his.
Philip K. Dick might be the most adapted science fiction writer of all times. When you look at like how many of his stories, short stories, novels, and so forth, have been turned into movies, into groundbreaking movies, or at least into very popular movies. I mean, he wrote Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which got turned into Blade Runner. He wrote A Scanner Darkly, which got turned into A Scanner Darkly. He wrote We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which got turned into
Total
God's what's the
Recall. Is
movie?
that is that Total Recall or is
Yeah,
that
Total
the
Recall.
Adjustment
Yes,
Baru? Because
Total Recall, and he wrote so many of these stories, right? Minority Report. So many, like Philip K. Dick has had a huge impact on our perception of reality and on our media landscape. We tend to forget that because not necessarily everyone knows what their new favorite science fiction movie is based on beyond, well, Blade Runner basically. So I think Dick has always had that recognition. He's definitely not like the the easiest author to read.
oh no, I often tell people who dive into PKD, you got to read them in stages. you gotta you
Yeah,
gotta like read the short stories, then read the novels that aren't so crazy, then read some of the crazier novels, then read the real crazy novels, and then get to Valis. And you're just I still
yeah,
haven't read
yeah.
Valis to this very day, but I don't tell people to start with Valis first because my
Yeah,
god.
yeah, but I think that's an important aspect of the whole thing, right? Is that we do Philip K. Dick has had a huge impact, and a lot of people respect Philip K. Dick for the things he has done for science fiction and literature as a whole. And maybe the problem is more that he is sort of on that borderland between literary fiction, postmodern literary fiction, and full on easy to digest science fiction.
I guess I'll
You know,
enjoy
the
more of
spaceship
Pension
books.
because I got a similar or however you pronounce his name, Pension. I don't know,
Pinchon,
but
yeah, yeah.
I mean I liked Inherent Vice, but I was kind of like, okay, that's interesting. But again, I don't want to get too on the tangents. I guess the
Yeah.
second question I have here, we get
Hmm.
here. What do you? I don't know if this is similar to the first one, but what do you find so compelling about science fiction as a genre?
Hmm.
Do you like the
I
future
like
riff?
so I think what I like about science fiction compared to fantasy is that for a long time science fiction was more open as a genre, less confined within certain genre borders. And
Mm-hmm.
you can do crazy shit in science fiction. For a long time, science fiction authors got away with doing crazy shit that fantasy authors didn't dare to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly something that I personally appreciate. I'm like, hey, this is cool. You could write books where all characters are women, and you only realize like halfway through the book that it's only women in that book, and you're like, wow, this is cool. This would have been possible in any other genre as well, but you use science fiction because it kind of works, or because it's science fiction is sort of like a license to go beyond established borders because it's sort of expected for science fiction to break sort of expectations in a way that fantasy or literary fiction is not necessarily. And that's something I really appreciate about science fiction is that you can go and do crazy shit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I don't think a PKD. Well, I guess it would be interesting to see what PKD would have done with a fantasy novel, but that would have been that could have been something. But I think his particular brand of weirdness really helped him as a science fiction writer, even though he was on a league of his own, as I like to say.
Yeah, and compared to say, your Arthur C. Clarke's or Isaac Asimov's, a lot of like the stuff that he does as science fiction is not necessarily reliant on explicitly describing new technologies in exhaustive detail. He's not doing that.
No.
He's more like he's giving it terminologies, like using a terminology that sounds more scientific. But then again, to bring it back to Brandon Sanderson that we talked about earlier, right? It's like, how fantastic is Mistborn? He's using terminology that sounds very scientific. It's allomancy, which sounds, yeah, you use mancy instead of, logy or whatever you want to use for like a scientific terminology because it sounds cooler, but you still have very explicit rules for stuff. It's basically science fiction. We're just using words that make it sound like fantasy, but it is like a technology those people are using. It's not, magic. And I think a lot of that, which brings us back to the thing that we started about, is like the borders are fluid because so much is about like semblance and appearance and the words you use. It's like why is the reality shifting in say Flow My Tears, the policeman said, why is that considered science fiction? And the people flying around and pushing and pulling metals in Mistborn, why is that considered fantasies? Like, can you explain that?
Yeah,
and,
no,
and a lot of that is appearances.
Yeah, I mean, there's also like the new wave people, such as Thomas. I can't pronounce. I can never pronounce his last name. Dish, I think is how it's pronounced. I could be wrong.
Hmm?
Samuel Delaney, Brian Aldiss, Michael Moorcock to a lesser extent. I haven't read as much of his science fiction stuff. I've only read Elric, but
Yeah, you have
J.G.
that stuff, and then you
Ballard. I've
go
read
to like
High
to like
Rise,
the
which
new.
is I think is a
When you
very.
look to the new weird, like is is Perdido Street Station fantasy or science fiction?
I mean, I consider it a fantasy novel, but you could get away with calling it a science fiction novel for sure. Because there's there's points where Isaac goes on diatribes about his scientific theories, and you're like, oh god.
Yeah, and
Also, because
you
I've
have the
known people
steampunk
like
elements.
Isaac
You have
too.
the constructs that use computer stuff, and you know what I mean.
And like
These
they try
borders
to
have always been
explain the
sort of
crisis
porous.
energy, and you're like, oh okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Need to do
And then I think it's important to keep that in mind, and I think that's partly why Philip K. Dick is so interesting as an author, is that he always straddles that. He uses scientific terminology, and he does write stories that are very clearly science fiction, and then he goes into stuff that is closer to what you might call magical realism, or just paranoia fiction, or religious fiction, or all kinds of other stuff that we just lump together because we can call it science fiction and get away with, not taking it too seriously, I guess.
Also, hilariously, in Perdido Street Station, the epigraph is from Philip K. Dick. We can build you, which I haven't actually read.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. For
yeah.
reasons, for very good
For
reasons.
yeah, because that which
Yeah.
is interesting, new weird, because like weird fiction that could be a whole different genre, that could be a whole different conversation, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I think weird fiction's interesting because like a lot of people use that as a basically they use it as a phrase to just describe supernatural horror. Now, to be
Yeah.
fair, they have started to involve science fiction fantasy because I don't think it is just a funny phrase for horror. And I do like weird
Yeah.
horror a lot, but I just think again, I guess the language, the dialogue and language around genres really
Mm.
fascinates me for some reason, which is another reason why I started the State of Science Fiction, because I want to
Mm.
hear other people's perspectives on well,
Yeah.
what they think science fiction is, rather than because we're all different, so I'm gonna hear
Yeah.
different responses every time. But
So here's what I think. What is interesting about science fiction, in a lot of ways, like
the big
you
thesis.
have that freedom. You have that freedom. You can get away with stuff in science fiction that other genres with more rigid conventions don't allow you. But because it's science fiction, and even though it is not necessarily done that way, it's sort of like this is the future, and we could get there. There's always that sort of possibility that like we could get there if we really tried really hard. It's like now we won't, develop like warp drives and do Star Trek, but there's elements in there that we could strive for. There's an aspirational aspect to science fiction. And that is incredibly important because keeps the future it keeps the future open. And that's something we can look back to. It's like how a lot of like technology we have today has been influenced by people who read science fiction and maybe misunderstood it because they're idiots or whatever. But how science fiction has had an impact on the development of technology before, and we need to harness that. And there's like it was years ago. There's an essay by Neil Stephenson, whom I really appreciate, although I disagree with his libertarian ideas on like powerful billionaires doing disruptive stuff. I think he's wrong there. But he like years
We,
ago he
we, we,
wrote
we know of
an
your
interesting.
we know of your long-standing distaste with capitalism. Yeah, we hear you.
It's not so much capitalism in that regard. I think it's something that like Stephen Erickson also kind of fell for a bit in Rejoice, and a lot of us, a lot of
I
people
forget he wrote
did.
science fiction.
Hmm?
I forgot that
Oh yeah, he
Steve
did.
Erickson wrote science fiction.
Oh, he did. Both like Star Trek parodies and Rejoice are science fiction. No, but I think at some point, because state systems and so forth are often very slow and so forth, and you had a bunch of people, especially with like the tech hype around like the first say the around the millennium and like the first decade of this millennium, basically there were situations where everyone was like, well, maybe because the state is so slow and mired down, we need sort of tech billionaires sort of breaking the mold and actually just doing things. um I think we've moved beyond that because the people that everyone kind of bet on, like Elon Musk, have proved themselves to be massive dickheads. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Elon,
um,
not a nice guy. Well, not always. I think he's
but,
just
but
weird.
that's
To be honest
yeah.
with
But
you.
I think there was a time in like the early 2000s where people that got frustrated with you know the state or like systems being slow to adapt to and these are smart people, right? Stephen Erickson, Neil Stephenson, a lot of these people go like, well, look, climate change is a fucked up thing. And we've been telling people about this for ages, but our governments are not doing anything. So a billionaire going, I'm gonna make everyone drive electric cars because you guys need to actually change. That suddenly is incredibly appealing. Now,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, that guy turns out to be Elon Musk, and there's all kinds of problems. But I see why,
Who
for a time,
also,
that was a thing.
little fun fact: Elon Musk is apparently a fan of science fiction, which does not
I
surprise me.
know. The even more fun thing is that that Elon Musk is a huge fan of the Culture series by Ian M. Banks, which is
That's one
interesting
I've
because
still yet to read. I've wanted to read
okay,
Banks.
so here's the thing. I love the Culture series. They're great books. They're also very much about socialism. they're very much they're very much about a post-scarcity socialist utopia. They're all the things that Elon Musk is not about, and he's just not getting it. And like we often talk about, reader comprehension and
Yeah.
all of that stuff. Like Elon Musk has not understood the culture. He just sees some of the cool technologies, goes like, I want that. But the underlying idea that all of this only works because humans don't need to work to make money because they live in a post-scarcity society. That part he has conveniently ignored or just never understood.
Yeah, yeah, God, there's so many sci-fi writers I want to try. Like, well, aforementioned Thomas Dish. I wanted to try
Yeah.
Samuel Delaney for a long time. Uh, Ian Banks, of course, because I've heard culture's big thing. Ursula K. Le Guin, which
Yeah,
particularly she's like number one on my list of writers I really want to try. I just
yeah,
haven't had the
definitely
mood
worth
hit me.
definitely worth reading. But to bring it back to what I wanted to say about that Neil Stephenson essay.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Um, so he wrote an essay about like positive science fiction. He said he kind of went back to that, like, hey, look, a lot of technology that we have today is invented or got like formed by people who read science fiction in the 80s and then went and did stuff inspired by that.
yeah.
And we need to write positive science fiction. We need to write science fiction that goes and does new things just to keep open that like horizon of imagination for the next generation. We need to have positive science fiction that develops and plays with ideas, whether they, work or not doesn't really matter. But we need to keep that imaginary space open for stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
that's an interesting aspect. I think he's right about that. And there's other authors who talk about that as well. It was like, yeah, um, a lot of science fiction that is written today, like most science fiction that is written today, assumes that the future will be some form of capitalism. And it's not necessarily about like me liking or disliking capitalism. There is a problem if we can only imagine the future to have one specific economic system,
Mm-hmm.
because
Um.
it shuts off different avenues of imagination exploration and intellectual exploration. Not every future is worth actually building, but every future is worth imagining.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something in there in that power of science fiction, in the same way that there's a power in, like, a radical power in fantasy when it comes to world building. Someone like China Mieville pointed out, I was like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you can create every world you want, so why would you create only worlds that are like ours? Go wild, do crazy shit, imagine
I don't think
places that are utopias.
I don't think I have the imaginative power of China Mieville, and it makes me very sad. But you know,
Yeah, but but you could have, and I think we all have the potential to have that. It's sort of like imagination is bounded by the stuff that we have already experienced, read, encountered, and so forth. And the more that breaks molds, the more we can actually, go beyond that as well, and test the boundaries of our imagination. But our imagination is bounded by the stuff that we have read, that we have watched, that we have experienced, and so forth, that we have played. It always is sort of bounded by that, and we can test those boundaries and go beyond that. But we can't just invent something completely new. That's not how imagination works. Imagination is way more about testing boundaries and going beyond those boundaries, not just like by inventing like a new dimension of imagination. You know what I mean?
yeah. I hear you. So to get going to the third question, which is more of just we can just geek out about stuff we like. What are some of your favorite tropes in science fiction? That just feel free to just splurge out if you want. Or, I don't know,
I don't know. I'm not very much like a trope kind of guy. I can talk about like books that I really loved and
all
think
right, you can talk
you
about
know,
that if you want. I mean, feel free. I mean, but
and we can try to figure out whether there are like sort of tropes in there that kind of tie those together.
I mean,
Um,
you like Philip K. Dick, so I guess you like
I like
weirdness.
Philip. I like weird stuff. I like I mean, I've said that before. I like how science fiction sort of opens possibilities, because possibilities give us hope. And
Mm-hmm.
when I look at the world that I live in right now, it's not exactly the most hopeful place, right? We live in a place where, like, yeah, this planet's going to burn in like the next 30 years, basically. If we don't, descend into civil war or whatever else, it's not the most hopeful of times that we live in right now. So the idea of just like showing radically new options, that's something I personally really like. So I'm way more focused on the form of science fiction that shows like different forms of society compared to science fiction that talks about radical new technology. Because
Yeah, I
I
agree
think,
with you.
yeah,
I think that's really I think the marriage between technological and how humans will react to it. I think is really kind of the golden zone of sci-fi. Though I'm more interested in how people will react to it rather than just the technology itself and how it'll
Yeah.
affect the world. I mean,
Yeah, I think that's the important part is like we need to change the way we are as humans. We need to change that much more than we need to change the tools that we use.
so you like more
Because our
like
tools,
so you like more social science fiction? Is that what you're saying?
yes, yeah, very
Okay.
much. Because I think
Okay.
when we look at like the you know the world that we live in right now, the society we live in right now, our technology has already outpaced our society in so many ways. We're slow to catch up with like a digital society, right?
Yeah.
Tech, I mean, seriously, like the way we deal with social media, the way we deal with the speed or the speed up that digital technology has brought to our lives, we are so far behind as a society, as humans. Um, it's way more important to focus on these ways society can change than we need to focus on like having faster rockets or whatever. It's like those will come no matter what, or they won't. Who knows? But we need to focus on both like how we as societies can change, but also to figure out what parts of say our individual cultures are worth preserving, how
um.
or how technologies do impact stuff that is important to our identities. Like see, our home cultures are often important, or they form of our identities, so we need to figure out how to keep the parts that are worth keeping, and how to preserve those and adapt those to keep cultural identity in a lot of ways. And I think that's something that science fiction can do, and there's certainly science fiction that has done that in great ways. There's sadly all the countries that he's ever written about have turned into into authoritarian regimes, but Ian MacDonald has written some great books on the Dervish House on Turkey, and Brazil on Brazil, and River of Gods on India in the 21st century. And it's all of these are explorations on how a society, a very specific culture, does change with technology while still remaining very uniquely that specific culture. And I think that's the strength of science fiction that I like, the way of creating interesting societies with all the things that make a society interesting, like rituals, practices, all that stuff, much more than looking at the the very specific details of one specific technology. That's not necessarily what I like.
No, yeah, I hear you. I mean, I kind of had a feeling that this might happen because I know you're a bit more of a cerebral thinker. Not saying that we're all above that. We all have the things we like. I get that, but I know you're kind of more of a cerebral thinker rather than like, oh, this spaceship's really cool, or something like that. So I guess I'll ask another question here, but like for well, we've already kind of talked about this, but like, who do you think are some of the greats of science fiction? If you could name a couple, I mean, you can go nuts if you want.
Over throughout history or right now?
Either or, I'm not. I won't be
Okay,
picky.
throughout history, well, definitely. I mean, Philip K. Dick, definitely.
Yes,
Ian M.
we
Banks,
were just
Ian M.
we
Banks,
keep
no
coming
question
back to
asked.
PKD. I love it. I love it.
Yeah, well, no,
I
like
feel like a
Philip K.
lot of
Dick,
people don't
definitely.
appreciate it.
Ian M.
It makes me
Banks,
sad.
Ian M. Banks, definitely. I would say, hmm, I'm always worried. Like, it's so easy to say Frank Herbert, and I'm not sure if I actually think Frank Herbert is that great of a. Yeah, he's done Dune, and Dune is incredibly impactful for a lot of people, but I don't think he's that. You know, people that has have at least impacted my experience of fantasy. Ursula Le Guin, science
Yeah.
fiction, definitely.
I was about. Yeah, that's interesting you say that. I'm not really. I wasn't really a big fan of Dune. So, I mean,
Hmm?
I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. It's kind of my, I guess, pet peeve with science fiction is that it's far more thematic, but there's not enough like characterization where it really feels like the thematic material it doesn't feel natural, I guess is saying. Because I think, I think character and theme can be married quite beautifully, but often or not, it's not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really brutal when you read stuff like Asimov. Like, read the Foundation
Oh yeah,
novellas in the
Asimov
first.
is. I mean, unless you read like
That's terrible.
if you read like
That's
iRobot, like, oh, you'll get more
yeah,
like of what I like. But
yeah,
Foundation is kind of like. I mean, I like history, but it's like a particularly dry history book.
yeah. Ursula Le Guin definitely.
Mm-hmm.
I would say for me personally, definitely William Gibson.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I haven't read him
Incredibly
yet.
impactful. Incredibly impactful writer in a way that he's able to sort of sense aspects of technology and how he's very much on that, like how technology impacts society and human nature. He's very much that kind of writer. It's a bit more crude in his early, like in the Sprawl trilogy with Neuromancer. It's a bit more on the nose there compared to later ones. But his like sort of I don't know how they're called officially. Like he wrote a trilogy in like the early 2000s. So they're called Pattern Recognition, Spook Country, and Zero History. And they're sort of like near future things. And those are incredibly well done when it comes to sort of predicting and or taking specific aspects of sort of counterculture or like subcultural technology things and turning and looking at how they impact society in a lot of ways. He's really good at that. Like William Gibson is one of the best in that regard. So definitely William Gibson. Neil Stephenson similarly also has a great sense for extrapolating specific trends in technology. So definitely Neil Stephenson.
Mm-hmm.
For me personally, Ian MacDonald,
Oh yeah, I've heard
incredible
you.
sci-fi writer.
I've heard you mention him.
Yeah, he's one of those people that I always talk about. And no one ever reads Ian MacDonald for reasons that I can't fathom. But Ian MacDonald is an incredible writer and absolutely fascinating as a science fiction writer. Really, you can't say too many positive words about that guy. Further writers, Lavi Tidar.
I had a
I
feeling
also
you'd bring him
always
up.
mention that guy. Yeah, because he does that kind of stuff. He has that like sort of ongoing expanding universe with stuff like Central Station and Neon being set in that as novellas and fix-ups and novels. And
Yeah, I saw our mutual friend Liam really enjoyed Central Station, so
yeah,
I'll have to pick that up.
yeah, rightly so. So Lavi Tidar definitely. For me personally, Cameron Hurley.
Oh yeah, I think I've heard of
Uh,
him. Yeah, yeah.
that's a her.
Oh God, I'm an idiot.
Cameron, yeah, well,
I've
with
heard that
you
name. We'll
with
put
your
it that way.
language and your names, it could be all kinds of genders. No,
Heard,
like Cameron
I've,
Hurley is Cameron Hurley's a woman.
I've
Um,
heard that name. I'll put it that way.
Cameron Hurley, both the incredibly in your face, raw, brutal, angry, feminist sci-fi of God's War, which is really good if you like angry feminist sci-fi.
Oh, there was a series some people were telling me about recently. Is that the one she wrote? The series? What's it? Didn't she have a series?
Like she has that the first book is called God's War. It's called The Beldam Apocrypha, and they're like about this angry, like sort of matriarchal society, this angry woman bounty hunter that is very much your sort of like noir hard boiled
Oh,
kind
say
of
no more.
character,
I'm picking that up. Let me add that to
constantly
the list.
drunk, constantly fucking around and decapitating people. It's really cool.
I don't know
But
about decapitating people, but I am going to pick that
um,
noir sci-fi. I'm picking that shit up.
it's really good. God's War, really good. I personally think her best one to date is The Light Brigade, which is sort of a Starship Troopers, but with time travel and obviously a less libertarian fascist agenda than the original text.
I was
um,
gonna, or sorry, continue what you were saying.
hmm?
It didn't sound like you were done. I'll have to hold on. I'll have to.
Cameron Hurley, definitely one of the most interesting sci-fi writers right now. I would say N.K. Jemisin, but it's broken to a fantasy or science fiction. I don't know, but there is something there that I'll always keep an eye on.
Yeah, there's a couple names I would add to that. Ray Bradbury. I don't know what you guys
Yes,
think of Ray Bradbury, but I think Martian Chronicles on
Martian
its
Chronicles
own.
is insanely good.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's. I mean, you could argue it's fantasy, and like, you know what? I don't really care at this point. I still think
It's
it's a
it,
great. It's great.
I think it's like Bradbury is like similarly to Kurt Vonnegut, who's also
Also, Kurt
they are
Vonnegut.
sort of these kind of
I've only read Slaughterhouse-5 and Harrison
skip.
Bergeron, but I really enjoy Kurt Vonnegut. What I've read.
I really really love Cat's Cradle. I think what's interesting with both like Bradbury and Vonnegut is that they are sort of on the border between science fiction and just literary fiction.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Again, it's really
they're
interesting how
also
that
like very
works.
much, especially Ray Bradbury is very much 1950s 1960s America writer. A lot of the stuff goes back to this, like when you read something like Dandelion Wine and stuff like that,
hmm
is very much Something Wicked This Way Comes.
It
That
is
stuff is very
nostalgic, sure. Yeah, I'll give you that.
I'm not saying nostalgic because it's sort of written at the time, but he does very explicitly sort of like evoke a specific time. The time that Stephen King is constantly trying to evoke is how I would say that.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. I really like Stephen King though. So,
um okay, another sci-fi
well,
author I always have to mention because I really like him. He's nothing I don't want to say nothing special, but he often flies under the radar. Is definitely Alistair Reynolds.
oh yeah, I've
Um
heard a lot of him. Yeah, that's interesting. You say he flies
Alistair
under the
Reynolds
radar. I've
is
heard about him a lot.
yeah. But I think it's important for me to sort of explain why I think Alistair Reynolds is actually important because he does on the surface rarely do something spectacularly unique. He's not doing crazy shit. He's more like writing very um sort of like usually stories on the border between sort of the harder sci-fi side of things and the sort of in that gray zone between space opera and hard sci-fi a lot of times. What I really appreciate about Alistair Reynolds is how he changed over time, how he's um, actively trying to become inclusive in a way that is like, especially your general space opera,
hmm
hard sci-fi, rocket ship sci-fi stuff, right? Spaceship sci-fi has long been incredibly white and male and Anglo-American.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, I know you might have gripes with this one, but I really do. Well, before he went crazy, I with the sex stuff, I quite enjoy Robert Heinlein a lot. I mean,
Oh, I have no, I've enjoyed my Robert A. Heinlein. That's not the point.
oh,
Um,
well, I know that like he's just an interesting guy all around. I think Robert Heinlein, if you really think about it.
definitely.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, no,
if you read
definitely. Like,
about him and if you read his work, he's a really like I think the. I mean, also I read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress in a really formative time in my life, so I have a soft spot
mm,
for it. So it might just be that, but I do think he is good.
mm.
I do
You
think
might
he's
you
worth
might you
reading.
might want to try the Luna trilogy by Ian MacDonald because he kind of takes The Moon is a Harsh Mistress and plays with it and deconstructs some of its libertarian underpinnings, like ideological underpinnings,
I'll,
and looks at like the consequences of that
I'll
and
have to
turns
add
it
that
into a
to.
bit
I'll
more.
have to add it to the list, as they say.
Someone has called it Game of Thrones in space. I'm not sure if it, doing the work any good to compare to Game of Thrones, but it's certainly taking the idea of a lunar society in conflict with Earth and doing all the stuff that Moon as a Harsh Mistress does, but from a less less hardcore libertarian perspective, I guess. No, but what I was trying to say about Alistair Reynolds is that Reynolds starts out with your very classic science fiction rocket ships, well, spaceships doing spaceship stuff and so forth. And over time, you can see him actively becoming, as a writer, trying to be more inclusive, having more, female characters, including sort of questioning gender roles, questioning gender identities, setting an entire series sort of like in a more well, not in the UK or the US, but like setting it in Portugal and East Africa, for example, and moving deliberately away from the standards of science fiction. That's something I really appreciate because it's one thing, sort of, to go like, oh, science fiction is so white, but it's also interesting for like science fiction authors to go like, well,
Yeah,
I guess we should try. And it's like, is he perfect? No, but it's I
I mean,
appreciate
it has
someone.
been very white. I'll give him that. I can't
Yeah,
deny
yeah.
that it has been very
And
white.
he's an astrophysicist from Wales. You have to look very hard to find someone who's less white, who's more white than that guy. But I appreciate someone go actively trying to move and change over time, and sort of in a way that feels authentic and not just I'm trying to sort of like cash in on some trend or whatever, but like more like, look, I've done this before. Maybe I should actually try to be more. There's a willingness to learn and move with the times that I really appreciate about what Alistair Reynolds does. Yeah, I know. I just really like his books. They're good.
Yeah, there's this
They
other science fiction series I've heard of. I can't think of the name. I'm trying to look for it on my Goodreads. I can't find it for whatever reason, but it's like a epic space opera something. I don't know. It's
you're
also
saying
written by
you're thinking about the Expanse, right?
no. It's written by a woman.
Good. Hmm.
I can't think of it at the moment.
The Imperial Raj stuff written by Anne Leckie.
No, it's newer. Like it came out a few years ago. I can't.
Yeah, but that stuff is fairly new, like ancillary sword and ancillary justice. How old? Although it's like 10 years, maybe.
Oh, really? Oh, no, I
Not that
don't know.
old.
I haven't read them, so I don't know very much about them.
They're good. They're fun, and they made me drink
Um,
even more tea than I usually drink.
was another one. I mean, I liked Jonathan Lethem's Gun with Occasional Music. I thought that was a nice little tribute to noir and PKD. With a little Aldous
I
Huxley
still
in there.
haven't read that one, but I'm very much interested in it. I just haven't read it yet.
It's fun. It's a lot of fun. It's real good. If you like old fashioned noir, you'll get a kick out of it.
Mhm. And
Um,
Latham did, in fact, like sort of edit like the final manuscripts of PKD, right?
oh yeah, I've been nervous to even touch that because like I mean PKD is already very far above where my brain is. Like his brain was just on a different level. Oh yeah, if
Yeah.
anyone knows what I'm talking about, what is it? The newer sci-fi series. It's written by a lady. I can't think of it. It was making the rounds. And it sounded really interesting, but you can let me know in the comments if you know. But well, I already kind of asked. I guess we already kind of went over this. But who are some newer science fiction writers you found to be compelling? Though, kind of already answered
Yeah, I
that.
think like Lavi Tidar, Cameron Hurley, N.K. Jameson when she does science fiction, Kat Valente when she does science fiction, which happens from time to time, and Lecky. There's a lot of stuff going on. Nedu Okorafor when she does science fiction in the Afrofuturism stuff. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there.
um, Jeff Vandermeer for me. I mean, I really like Jeff Vandermeer. I'm sorry, I can't help
No, no, no,
myself.
no, no. Jeff Vandermeer, absolutely. I just don't know how much science fiction. Although he's currently finishing like the next Southern Reach book, so maybe he's going back to science fiction. For
Yeah,
the last
no,
couple of years, he seemed to be very much engaged in just doing, environmental activism, which is probably more important right now. But
oh, it's mother. Oh, it's
so
mother.
there's certainly, but yeah, Vandermeer definitely people that have, people that
Mieville, though,
actually
I
aim to
wasn't.
change
Though I'm
the
sad to
future.
say I wasn't really into Embassy Town, but at the same time I don't think I was in the right headspace when I was reading it, so I might try it again at
Embassy
some
Town is
point.
a weird one. I like it, but it does have that slow pace at on the one hand, then it does like a lot of the high conceptual stuff about like the way language is formed
Yeah,
and
that was
understanding.
interesting, but it didn't quite have that vigor of Perdido Street Station, or which
No, 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 no. It's
I'm kind of afraid that Perdido Street Station has ruined has Perdido Street Station and the Scar specifically. I'm kind of afraid that they've ruined Miss Ovar for me. But
Mhm.
he's a great writer though, I think. Hope he does. Or
Were you
well,
talking like when you're thinking about like the space opera thing? Were you thinking of Becky Chambers or
no, God,
the Wayfarer series?
no,
Because
not that
I
one.
haven't read that one. Hmm?
Um, maybe I'll find it later and be like, oh, that's what it was called. Because I don't freaking know. Because like I
Mhm.
have so many freaking books on here. It's
Yeah.
devastating. But yeah, I guess kind of cutting back to what we were talking about at the beginning. Another next question I have here is, well, two questions anyway. Do you have any worries about where the science fiction genre is headed, or are there gripes with the genre that you would like to see improved, or and all? I mean, I'll let you think
Not
about it.
really. I mean, I think there's a bit of a danger sort of with the Expanse, I guess, which was incredibly successful and it's well done and so forth. But I think there's that sort of impetus to turn science fiction into something too too well-meaning without any sort of like edges. You know what I mean? It's like
Aw.
the Expanse is well written. The Expanse is basically blockbuster science fiction, and it works really well. It's vaguely progressive because we do have people with different skin colors and different cultural aspects in it, but we're not actually pressuring anyone to change anything, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I personally I want my science fiction to be angry and edgy, and I have the fear that
So you like
that it's easy
angrier. So you
not
want
to.
sci-fi to be more angry. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I want sci-fi to actively try to change the future, and for that you need to have actual political and sociopolitical political opinions, and not be afraid of actually putting them into your books.
You're a
And I
socially.
think
Oh,
it's
sorry.
yeah.
Oh no, no. Finish your thought, and then I'll ask you.
Yeah, I think it's kind of there's a trend to not do that because there's the need to sell like film rights and sell the rights to for adaptations and stuff for your books and suddenly there's an economic pressure to sort of mellow out the messages of your writing,
Mm-hmm.
and that's something that I find troubling with science fiction because if we bring it back to like science fiction, what I believe having the opportunity and sort of the duty to sort of expand our horizon, to expand our imaginary spaces that we can imagine the future to be like.
Mm-hmm.
If we subject that to economic pressure, then we're fucked.
I
And
mean,
that's sort of like my fear.
well, this actually brings me to another question. This kind of specifically for you, because I know you're more socially conscious individual than other booktubers out there. Do you think that sci-fi is an inherently political genre, or do you think it's like do you think politics is important in um I mean, I have my own thoughts, but I'm curious to hear what you think about it because again, you're a very socially conscious person from what I've seen.
I think so. I think all art is inherently political, and you can't escape that. I think it's
Okay,
easier
I've
to
heard this
see that.
before.
I think it's easier to see that in science fiction because so much of what we call science fiction is sort of like, hey, here's my version of the future. And if my version of the future differs from your version of the future or our current version of the present,
I mean, I
that
do.
is a political statement, no matter what you say, right? It
Mhm.
doesn't matter which version of like if your if like the image of the future I create is different from your image of the future or different from the present, that's a political statement. So it's easier to see science fiction as political. But fantasy can be just as political.
I think it's funny. I think that I mean, because I'm kind of I'm a philosophy buff, believe it or not. Even though I've been really bad at keeping up with it over the years. I do think that science fiction is an inherently philosophical genre. I think there is a lot of I do think there is a lot of great political science fiction stories. I do think
Mm-hmm.
I mean 1984 is kind of an obvious one for me. Though a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people use that to be like, we're turning into that right now, and I could rant about that, but I'm not going to. This isn't that show today.
Science 1984 is probably the most misunderstood book of the last century.
You know what? I mean, we probably have differing reasons for why we think that, but I agree with you on that. I do think a lot of people are just completely don't see that book at all. They're just like, it justifies our political beliefs. It's
Yeah,
not
no,
gonna do it. Not
but
gonna
he's
rant. Nope. No. No. No.
maybe
It
not
is a
today.
great.
But
It is a
he's
great book, though. A great piece
yeah.
of speculative fiction.
But I think what we need to figure out is like what we mean by political. I would say that imagining a different society is always political.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
It kind of goes back to that whole the, the like the 1960s 70s, that idea that like everything is political, like the private is political in a 1968 counterculture and so forth understanding, and I believe that. Whereas, there are some people who think political is like explicit party politics positions. I think that if you sit down and imagine a different world, that is a political act. And it doesn't matter whether that is like a total fascist state, or
Yeah.
it's like a post, or it's like Ian and Banks style post scarcity socialist utopia. It doesn't really matter. Like, imagining the future is a political act.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're going like, yeah, the future will be just like it is right now, that is still a political act because you claim at this point that the future should be like this.
Mm-hmm.
Or depending on what you write and how you write the future, you're claiming that the future should not be like that. Utopias are fundamentally political stories.
Mm-hmm.
Dystopias are fundamentally political stories.
Mm-hmm.
Anytime we try to
We'll give you
imagine a
that.
different society, we're doing politics.
I would go a step further. I think that science fiction is an inherently philosophical genre. Because there's a lot of stuff you could play with, like humanity's meaning in the universe, and well, I like a lot of
Hmm?
existential stuff, so that's usually where my brain heads to. You can do a lot of philosophical
Yeah, but
concepts like where
those
are we
two are
gonna
not
go?
contradictory.
Where are we gonna go? Where are we going to be as a society, as a people? What should we strive for as people? I think there's a lot of great philosophical discourse you can find
Yeah, but see
in it.
that's what I mean. I would call that political. You call that philosophical, and that's like a different. That's where we differ in like the terms we use, and that's what I meant. It's like
So
from
I
where I'm
guess we agree
standing.
then.
No, we totally agree on what science fiction is doing. I'm just saying that
We just have different terminology for it. I hear
I
you.
think like these are philosophical questions, but they're also inherently political questions because they
Oh.
imply that we need to change our mode of living, or that we will change our mode of living somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And the praxis, like we can think about that hypothetically, but as soon as this turns into like actual praxis, we're doing politics.
Yeah. I mean, I think I see where you're coming from though. It's definitely like I would agree that dystopian at least is a very political genre. I mean, my God. You kind of
So
have
is
to
utopia.
you kind of have to care about the state of the world to write science fiction. At least I think so. I could be wrong. There might be people who just like the spaceships and stuff, and I like that stuff too. But I do think that with really exceptional science fiction, you have to really care about the world, and you have to really want to fix it in some way.
Yeah, but
Or
that's kind of the point, right? Is like if you're writing science fiction that is just about like a bunch of dudes flying their spaceship through well space and I don't know, shooting at other spaceships and killing people and safe, you're still you're still making claims about society, about humanity. You're still explaining how the world works and about, the values of these people. And they may be just, personal honor and duty and following the vows they sworn to the Space King or whatever. You can do all of that, but that's still a form of politics because you're still making a claim on how society should run because you're something like it's about personal loyalty and honor and duty and following very specific ideals versus looking for the common good or having compassion for that. There are like political assumptions built into any story you tell, no matter what kind of story you tell. There's always political assumptions about how humans interact with each other, and that's kind of, I mean, that's politics. Politics is like, how do we as people hang out with each other, and how do we do that? That's politics.
well,
It's
yeah,
not just like how do we vote. It's not like which candidate do we vote for. It's like how do we actually make sure we don't constantly just kill each other.
yeah, exactly. Like how are we going to run a society where people aren't just shooting each other and whatnot?
Like as soon as we decide to run a society, we're doing politics.
Yeah, no, yeah,
That's kind of the problem, and that's why I think that science fiction or like all art is inherently political because it reflects like the views on society and human interaction of the artist, and it posits either a way society should be or a way society should definitely not be. But it does make statements on like human interaction that's political whether you want to or not. It doesn't have to have like very clear explanations like how to be socialist, capitalist, anarchist, or whatever, right? Like you read Foundation. Foundation is very much about like let's all be laissez-faire capitalists because capitalism will absolutely save the galaxy. That one is very blunt and in your face.
mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention Arthur C. Clarke. I mean, I won't pretend he's the most. Now I won't pretend that again, my what I base my taste on changes all the time. But I mean, I wouldn't call him the most character-driven um, writer. But I do think Childhood's End is a really great science fiction
Oh,
novel.
Childhood's End is fantastic. Also, it has the coolest aliens ever because they look like Satan, and I like that.
Yeah, yeah. I always think that part's hilarious. There's like, and like, but what I find
But
it.
that's the point.
I mean, there's a lot of
It's very
speculation
much
about human nature in that story that I really admire, even if there isn't
yeah.
like particular characters we're seeing it through. There's a lot of speculation about human nature that it's not necessarily. It's also a nice subversion of the alien invasion because it's not really the aliens who do it,
Yeah.
but it's like humanity and our own flaws and this kind of
Yeah.
deep down we like chaos, even though we were always like, oh, we want world peace. There's always that part of us that
Mhm.
likes chaos, or to
Yeah,
quote.
and I think there's an interesting thing there with a lot of those science fiction authors of that time. Whether it's Heinlein, who then goes off into his weird libertarian sex cult thing, or it's
Oh,
Isaac Asimov who does whatever Asimov is doing, or Arthur C. Clarke. A lot of these people, I mean, writing these stories in the late 50s and 60s, are coming out of World War II and are sort of facing the beginnings of the Cold War, the McCarthy era hunt for communism and so forth. And none of these people are explicit communists. Don't get me wrong, but I think there's a level there where there's a
but they were
hope
talking about
in
some
those
freaky
science fiction
shit.
stories about like as the idea that humanity as a whole can actually transcend these things and become like one thing in the future that I personally find somewhat endearing almost in a way. And Arthur C. Clarke certainly does have that in stuff like, especially like, Childhood's End, where it's like, yeah, we'll leave all of that behind, and you have like the next generation of kids that are suddenly like have all these superpowers and can just like transcend all of this stuff
Basically, like
and
little
become.
little Doctor Manhattans.
Yeah, but I think it's important to understand that there is that hope that we can actually be better.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
that I think is important for at least that era of science fiction, is the idea that we can actually do better because we've just come out of this incredibly traumatic cataclysmic event. It's like, holy shit, we as a species have fucked up. Obviously
We could blow
Germans
ourselves
have
up if we
fucked up
aren't
more.
careful.
Germans, Japanese, and Italians have fucked up more than others, but we as a species have completely fucked up, and we've done the dumbest thing ever, which is like after that we run into the Cold War and we kind of go down the same path to destruction. And the science fiction at that time is holding up that hope that we could do better as a species.
Mm-hmm,
And that's a political statement to go
mm-hmm.
like, we could do better, we can be better. The hope that humans are not damned to just repeat their mistakes. I think that's, you have like your very incredibly depressing sort of all the way back to Thucydides, the idea that humans are, forced to doomed to repeat history because we fuck up again and again and again. You have like that goes through the Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War, which then gets translated by Thomas Hobbes, and he writes Leviathan, which is sort of humans are not to be trusted. We have that very
We're a bunch
specific
of
thing,
yeah. He's of the opinion like we're all like vicious animals, and we need to be we need to
yeah,
chill out.
and I mean
We need a strong power to keep us from being crazy.
doing dumb shit. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um,
That's a good way to put it.
and I think it's important to see that, and you have science fiction authors who take that lesson from World War II. One that I personally really really appreciate is is Walter John Miller, um, uh, the guy who wrote A Canticle for Leibowitz. I need to look up his name. I think it's Walter M. Miller. That's his name, Walter M. Miller Jr. Wrote A Canticle for Leibowitz. Is an absolute masterclass in science fiction. It's one of the best science fiction books of that time.
Yeah, I've heard people mention that book.
It's incredibly depressing too.
I
It's
haven't
it's
read
it's
it.
it's fun, it's funny, but it's also depressing. It's that like very fatalist kind of humor of humanity just
I mean, I like
repeat.
Cormac McCarthy, so I mean,
Oh
throw whatever
yeah,
you got
I
at me.
say like um, roughly the story of A Canticle for Leibowitz is this monastery
I
that
mean,
is there to collect all human knowledge,
I'm reading this.
and that's where human knowledge survives when humanity annihilates itself in a nuclear war. And then you follow that monastery, how they rebuild and reinvent technology after that nuclear war. And then it ends with the next nuclear war because humanity does not fucking learn.
It's interesting you say that because, like, I'm looking at us now, and I mean, yeah, sure, we could be doing better, but we could be doing a lot worse at the same time. Like, we haven't blown ourselves up, and Raph, you have to take
Hmm.
that into account. Maybe we're not that bad.
Yeah, but
Maybe
I
we
think it's
don't want to
important to
blow
understand. Like,
ourselves up.
See, when Walter Miller wrote that book, that was after, like, Walter M. Miller was, like many other sci-fi authors, he was a soldier in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
But he was part of the bomber crew that actually destroyed Monte Cassino Monastery.
Oh,
Now, I don't know if you know what Monte Cassino Monastery was.
is that it? It sounds
Monte
Italian.
Cassino, Monte Cassino is the monastery where Benedict, Saint Benedict, started the Order of the Benedictines. It's the first monastery ever. That's where monastic orders, where monks and shit started. And because the SS kind of went into hiding in that monastery, the Allies bombed that thing into absolute rubble. And
Ouch.
Walter Miller was part of the people that flew those raids, those bombing raids, to destroy the oldest monastery in the world and turned that into rubble. And that made him write that book about, like, how we as humans are apparently incredibly bad at learning and are doomed to repeat that self-destructive impulse. And I think it's important to keep that sort of as a parallel to people like Arthur C. Clarke writing Childhood's End and other authors of that ilk, going like, we do have a chance to move on and do something else. And that's sort of like that sort of political discourse, philosophical and political discourse that science fiction always does. Like, does human nature force us to repeat the mistakes that we've learned, that we've done before, or do we have a chance to actually go somewhere else? And I think science fiction has that potential. We can imagine a better future. We can strive to create that better future, and that's the power of science fiction compared to
Amen, brother.
other
I would.
other genres of fiction, of literature,
You put that. You
to
put that
make that
quite
more
nicely.
explicit.
Oh, I was just saying you put that quite nicely. I think.
Hmm?
I've heard Kim Stanley Robinson is good, though. I don't know. He seems a little cerebral, but we'll see. I mean, I'll try him at some point.
I do really appreciate what he does with the Ministry for the Future, because it is very much a roadmap. He's more like closer to, like, the scientific side of science fiction,
Mm-hmm.
looking at actual options and sort of doing like these gaming through, like, what would happen if we use this technology and so forth. He does that a lot, and I appreciate that. And he's no Kim Stanley Robinson is really good. Go read The Ministry for the Future. It's a good book. It doesn't have a really good plot. The characters suck, but the technology and the political and sociopolitical stuff is really important and good.
Oh, but I like when all of it's combined, bro. Oh, like,
Well, for that, my friend, you should go and read Hopeland by Ian MacDonald, which
you know what?
is
I'll add Ian McDonald to the list, and then when I read it eventually, I'll text you and let you know how right you were.
it's a good book. It's a
But
really good book, and it's very much like combining the idea of, like, how to actually deal with climate change and how to sort of survive climate change and make sure that we as humans survive and society survives and adapts, but also with a lot of actually human characters and people doing people stuff, and it's a good book.
Also, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I read Light from M. John Harrison, and I've only read that and the Centauri device, which is okay. I
Mhm.
mean, I think it's it's a nice proto cyberpunk if
Mhm.
you're interested in knowing where the genre is. But I think Light is a far more interesting book in terms of the content
That's really interesting.
um and well, I mean, when I think of best, I think of singular vision. I think M. John
Mhm.
Harrison has a very singular vision of of the genre he where I mean, I do want to read Veraconium at some point, and also Nova Swing.
Mhm.
Kind of continue on with the I can't pronounce the name, but it's the tract.
Yeah, the Kefahuchi track, Kefahuchi, whatever,
Kefahuchi,
however you
thank you.
pronounce that.
Yeah, I know. I'm gonna
I know what
ad-sub
you mean.
myself on
I think
YouTube trying to pronounce
M.
it.
John Harrison. M. John Harrison is interesting in that he's very much like that kind of postmodern sci-fi, very very much talking about, like, actual, like, our current society and projecting stuff into his sci-fi. Like, M. John Harrison is a very political author.
Also, another thing of trope. I guess I like postmodern science fiction for some reason. I don't know why.
Hmm.
Like I like PKD. I
Hmm.
mean, I guess Jeff Van. I mean, would you call Jeff Vandermeer postmodern? No, actually, no. I wouldn't call him postmodern.
I mean, he's definitely new weird, and that stuff is influenced by postmodernism. But
Because, like, I mean, I
I think
know.
those terms are only slightly helpful. I think like M. John Harrison is definitely very postmodern
I'm like, I don't
in his
know,
approach.
guys.
Mhm.
I don't know, guys. I'm always bad with this, but I like really out there weirdness. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and like at the end of the day, all these labels don't mean that much. Like a lot of these are more about like explaining what kind of people these authors hang out with. It's more like about schools than it is about like literary genres or subgenres. Like you're a new weird guy. That's mostly because you hang out with the same kind of people and talk to each other. It's like, like Michael Swanwick, China Mieville, Jeff Vandermeer, and so forth. Those people are writing at the same time. They're
Oh no,
sort
we
of
were going
following the
so well.
same thing. It's more like they're like a gang. They're like a clique or gang. They're not like a sort of genre. They're just like all influenced by the same thing around the same time. And the same goes for like postmodernism. There are people who go like, I'm going to write a postmodern novel, but a lot of these people are just like living through, you know, the 70s and 80s, that like sort of loss of meaning in a lot of ways, the way that capitalism takes it. And it's important. I know I always bang on about that, but like the postmodernism
You and
is very
capitalism.
much no, it's very much tied. It's very much tied to that the way that certain stuff, certain forms lose meaning, and certain things become just like more images and symbols you can just like combine, because it's very much about that confusion that comes with like that sort of like deluge of systems, of symbols, of everything, of meaning that you have in like the late 70s, early 80s. um Frederick Jameson, who is a Marxist author, but he's a literary critic and a lot of other things. And he mentioned that he thinks that the Sprawl trilogy, Neuromancer by William M. Gibson, is the most postmodern novel ever, or the novel that explains postmodernism, or embodies postmodernism the best, because it is about that feeling of being overwhelmed by just everything crashing down. So suddenly everything loses meaning because you just like sort of rushed away by that like flood of symbols, of meanings, and so forth, and you create a new meaning out of that. And I think he has a point there. And once again, I think it's, in hindsight, we like to sort of apply genre labels, but people writing or creating art don't set out to create a postmodern novel or a
No,
new
I
weird
would I would
novel
think
or
not.
whatever. No, it's more like you're part of this. The the people you hang out with at the time you hang out with them, that influence. And then someone comes back later and goes like, "Oh, I'm gonna call this postmodernism."
Oh, I was also
It's
gonna.
always like a hindsight thing.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah. I was also gonna mention. I like Harlan Ellison a lot. I know there's a lot of people. I know he's a very contentious figure for a lot of people, and if you
I
don't
like
like
him.
him, I mean, if you don't like him, I don't blame you. He wasn't someone who went out to make friends. But man,
I like Harlan
I
Ellison
think he was a
especially for that.
I think he
Harlan
was a
Ellison is a very interesting writer and worth reading.
I think he was a very sharp guy about. Now I don't think I'm as pessimistic as he is, but I do think he's written some really classic stories that people should go read if you want a well-rounded view of the sci-fi genre. At least in my
Yeah, and
opinion.
once again, like you read Harlan Ellison, and a lot of his
So I was
short
about to say you
stories are
probably
much
like that.
close.
You know, you say you like angry stuff. Like my God,
Oh
he's
yeah,
pissed.
yeah. But my point is, a lot of his stories are much closer to, say, a Philip K. Dick than they are to a Robert A. Heinlein.
Oh yeah, no, I mean he was around for all of it. Like he was around during the golden age. He was around during the new
Hmm?
wave.
Yeah, Harlan Ellison is. Yeah. Anyway, like Harlan Ellison is brilliant. People should read more Harlan Ellison. Not just "I have no mouth and I must scream." The other stuff is good as well.
I also really like A Boy and His Dog, but you know it's I like post-apocalyptic stuff.
Hmm. I think
I
like what I appreciate about Harlan Ellison is there's a consistency there and a willingness to never compromise like an artistic vision. He just like he has a fucked up idea, he just puts that thing down, and
if you like it,
yeah,
great.
there's
If you don't, too fucking bad.
yeah, and I think that makes a lot of there's stories in there that I read and I'm like, holy shit, I hated that story. But I appreciate that someone actually sat down and wrote the thing and did not just like ignore it or flinch away. And I think that unflinchingness is something that I really appreciate about Harlan Ellison.
I guess for the last question here, are there science fiction novels that you would like to read in the future? I'm sure there may be some, but if you do, please share them.
I still need to read To Like the Night Lightning by Ida Palmer. It's one of those things that I'm sure I like, or at least have a lot of things to say about, but I have not yet started Terra Ignota, and I need to.
Wait a minute. That's it. That's the one. That's what I was. That's what I was talking about. Shit.
Yeah, that's the one. All right, Terra Ignota by Ada Palmer is the one that I really, really need to read, and I really want to read.
That. Oh yes, yes. That's the one I was. That was the one I was talking about earlier. Yeah, Terra Ignota. God, that was driving me
Now we got it.
crazy.
All right. That's definitely the one that I really want to read. There's stuff like John Russ, the Female Man, whatever it's called. I want to read that. Um,
Read like Jerry
some
Cornelius.
look, it's more Michael Moorcock. I will never say no to more Michael Moorcock.
No, I was asking, have you read it, or is that one you're
I have
still
not.
looking
I
forward
have
to?
not, but I definitely want to.
Oh, okay. That's one I look forward to.
But that's sort of like the things like I'll see what happens. I'm not good at sort of making lists of stuff I want to read. Like Terra Ignota is the thing that I've had it on my phone like 3 times by now. I never got around to actually starting it because something always came up and then I got distracted and shit like that. But there's certainly more classics. There's more Philip K. Dick I could read. There's more Arthur C. Clarke short stories I could read. There's more Ursula Le Guin short stories I could read because those people were incredibly prolific, and no one,
Oh
like
yeah,
the
J.G.
amount of short
Ballard.
stories those people wrote is insane.
J.G. Ballard. I think High Rise is a fantastic book.
J.G. Ballard definitely.
Um,
Um,
Also, I mean, he's a bit more pessimistic than I am, but I really like. He's one of those pessimists I really like seeing their thought process. It's very fascinating. But then again,
Ballard is one of the.
he survived World War II, so I imagine he grew up surviving World War II. So I imagine he didn't have the rosiest view of humankind.
That's like the interesting thing that back in the day when Michael Moorcock was still like editor of New Worlds, the science fiction magazine, he published J.G. Ballard at the time. That's sort of like the framing that people often kind of ignore or misunderstand when they read something like Epic Pooh and him being pissed off about everyone just reading Tolkien knockoffs. It's like he's out there publishing people like J.G. Ballard and trying to actually, put meaningful stuff out there, and
He's
people go
putting
like,
his money where his
I'd rather
mouth
have
is.
like I'd rather read sort of Shannara than J.G. Ballard, and I can see how that is frustrating. I can see why people would prefer to read sort of Shannara. At least from the outset. I think they might change their mind after like 10 pages or so. But
I mean, I know
I can
what you
see the
mean.
frustration.
I know
Hmm?
what you mean. There's so many I want to get to. Ursula K. Le Guin is one who I'm constantly kicking myself I haven't gotten to yet. I just don't know where to start with her.
Yes.
Uh City in the Stars, more Arthur
Start
C.
start with
Clarke.
her, like just go through the Hainish cycle stuff and
Yeah, I was thinking of starting like the not is it the Last of Heaven? I don't know. I can't think of it at the
the
moment.
Late of Heaven and the Left Hand of Darkness. Those are different books. There's the Dispossessed. There's definitely the Word for World is Forest, which is really good. Rokanon's World. Like it doesn't matter with Le Guin. Very few of those things have to be read in order. Like Earthsea has to be read in order, but those are fantasy.
Um, yeah. Oh God, who else? City in the Stars by um, Samuel Chip Delaney,
Yeah.
Brian Aldiss, John Wyndham. Because I've seen some of his. He's kind of making a comeback. I hadn't really heard of him, and then I've seen him at my local bookshop, so I might try him
Hmm.
out. I think he wrote
Okay, if you want to read some,
the
like,
Trikids.
if you haven't read William Gibson, then definitely go for
Yeah,
read some
William
William
Gibson,
Gibson.
Neil Stevenson. Still a lot of people I need
Um,
to try. Ah,
if you want to
oh, it's brutal.
try some weird, like, if you want to try the most metal '80s cyberpunk novel ever, read Hardwired Ultims.
Jeff Noon, though, I've heard Jeff Noon's one of those.
That book is like pure adrenaline the entire fucking time. Yeah, 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 maybe.
I heard
One that
I
I
heard he kind of skirts genre though, so that might be interesting
yeah.
because I
One
like
that I
genre novels.
personally really like is George Alec Affinger's. He's got like a trilogy of cyberpunk novels. They're sometimes called the Budain novels and sometimes the Marid Odran novels. They're cyberpunk set in like a Middle Eastern setting.
Oh, that sounds cool. That's different for sure because we're so
And they're
selfish
like
out here in the Western world.
they're incredibly drugged up.
I was about to say we're
Also,
very.
everyone is transgender in those books.
Oh man, I bet that ruffled some feathers.
And that's the interesting thing. It didn't, because those books were written in the late '80s and early '90s, and no one batted an eye at it. It's like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I find it interesting about genre fiction like science fiction, fantasy, noir, horror, is that like
Hmm.
people I think we often complain that it's not taken as seriously, but I think that's also been used to its advantage because
Hmm.
you can get away
Yeah,
with more
you can do
stuff
stuff.
that
You
you
can
can
do
do stuff
stuff
you
on the
can't get
edges
away
that you
with.
can't do. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. They can't get away with and I don't know if Jonathan
yeah,
Franzen could get away with writing about a society all drugged up transgender people in the Middle East. I don't think you'll see that. I mean, maybe if you're Thomas Pynchon, you can get away with it.
yeah, probably.
I don't know. Again, I've only read one of his books, so I am not. I am hardly what is called an expert.
I do personally think that Inherent Vice is a fairly good entrance to his works because it is one of the tamest.
Oh no, I liked it a lot. I thought it was
It's also thematically very clear, like sort of like that the loss of like that alternative that we had in the counterculture movement, and how that kind of gets lost once Nixon comes into power, and suddenly things sort of lose that freedom. I think he captures that melancholy really well in Inherent Vice.
um yeah, I really like his playfulness, but again, I
Yeah.
might have an inherent vice discussion, and I'll invite you on at some point. And we can talk about it. But oh,
Mhm. Sure, I
would
like
you
it. It's a good book.
would you call pension? I've heard some people say pension sci-fi, but I'm kind of curious. That's like it's weird because
Pension
I
is
know he's one of those defies categories type of authors.
Yeah, like the same way I would not call Cormac McCarthy sci-fi or
Oh no.
anyone like that. But Pynchon is all over the place. I think he's sort of literary fiction like people call him meta-historical because most of his stuff is sort of set in the past, but it then also goes off the rails and does weird shit that is very much unreal,
I've heard
surreal and
Gravity's
whatnot.
Rainbow is freaking crazy. I mean, I'm scared of that book.
Gravity's Rainbow is pretty weird. Against the Day is also weird. Mason Dixon has this wonderful competition between a werebeaver and a Swedish axeman who actually comes from the Hollow Earth, having a wood chopping contest.
Mason and Dixon's one of the next ones I want to try out. But again, with pension, I don't know. I just like
It's a good book.
I'll have to try that one. But going back to the sci-fi, good God.
No, I think that they're sort of like people that encompass or incorporate elements of magical realism, science fiction, fantasy, humor,
More
surrealism,
Kurt
and
Vonnegut,
whatnot.
of course.
Yeah.
Oh man. I mean, I'll probably try The Expanse or in the Sun Eater book.
The Expanse is fun.
That kind of goes back to why I started the series and kind of the issue I have. I mean, I guess The Expanse is more science fiction, but there's this sense for me that it seems like sci-fi is losing its identity, but at the same time, it's weird. It's like science fiction's turning into fantasy, like with how they're again. A lot of it comes down to the marketing. It's not really the genre itself. I just don't like how it's marketed. It's kind of like again what you said about Brandon Sanderson a while back. It's just I don't love, and also BookTube hasn't helped with this. I mean, I don't want to name names here, but
Well, The Expanse is very much very clear-cut sci-fi.
well, I mean, yeah,
It's
I
sort of
definitely want to
somewhere
try
between.
it. I'm not against trying it.
No,
It's
look,
just
I enjoyed The Expanse. It's fun. It didn't leave a lasting impression, but it is guys in spaceships doing spaceship stuff.
and hey,
Which is cool.
I like that, but I like the more
But
cerebral.
I
That's
would
why
I
I
would
read
encourage
sci-fi.
you to I would encourage you to read The Light Brigade by Cameron Hurley. It's it's standalone. It's
I'll add
short.
that to my
It's
list.
space it's basically Starship Troopers with time travel and less fascist, which is not that hard to do because Starship Troopers is pretty fucking fascist.
Okay, yeah, I'll save that for another time. Because actually, I want to reread Starship Troopers. Good lord. Well, you're not on Twitter, but the other day people were arguing about if Starship Troopers is fascist. I'm like, oh my good lord.
It's fascist adjacent.
My response would be if you're talking about the book, complicated.
Yes,
Movie, definitely.
the movie is a satire. The question is whether the book is that or not, and I don't think it is. I think the movie is actually. I mean, the movie is very much making it very clear that the society it portrays is not, an ideal.
Well,
That's the whole
no.
point of the movie.
I think
It's
it's
like, yeah,
more. I
this
think it's more
society is
nuanced
fascist,
in the
and you don't want
book.
to be there.
I think it's more
Sorry.
nuanced in the book than it is in the movie because the movie is just like you said, it's a satire, which is
Yeah,
fine. But in the book, there's it sort of has that kind of fascistic, very strong, very manly because it's just that was kind of the guy who that was kind of who Heinlein
yeah.
was. But I think with Heinlein, I think what people get wrong about him is that he he liked ideas and he liked to explore them. He didn't really care if it pissed people off or it wasn't sexy per se. I think he was just
Yeah,
interested
I mean,
in
if you
exploring those possibilities.
compare Starship Troopers to say Stranger in a Strange Land, it's interesting to see that the same person wrote both books.
But yeah, I don't want to get into that. I mean, I could do my old shill rant video about Robert Heinlein at my unhinged rant about Robert Heinlein at some point. But
Yeah,
Raph, it is always a pleasure talking with you. I know it's probably getting late where you're at. I appreciate you coming on here and
it's
indulging me for
midnight.
the second episode, the long-awaited second episode of the State of Science Fiction.
Brendan, it's always fun. Do me a favor, read The Light Brigade, because
I will add
as
it
someone who
to
has
my to-be
actually
read
read,
sooner.
look, you've read Starship Troopers.
Yes.
And this is about like a special troop that drops in, and they jump in time. They fight the enemy, and they do the things that Starship Troopers does. And then it goes somewhere else, and it's really cool. And you might, I'm pretty sure you'll enjoy it. It's military sci-fi with a bit of a twist.
All right. Well, as I often like to do in these, if you have any social media or anything you'd like to shill, feel free.
Well, I am on the YouTubes, and I'm called Raf Blutaxt, and that's like all I have.
Fair enough.
I think.
All right. Well, until next time, a State of Science Fiction. Again, thank you, Raph, for coming on
Yeah.
here.
See you around, man.
Until next time.
Cheers.